Many thanks for your invitation, and I'm really flattered to see that my work was actually conceived by other researchers. And actually, Federico has already done an awesome job in explaining some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, so I don't have to go into as much detail as I thought. I would like to talk about a few things today. First of all, of course, motivate why I think this kind of research is important at all. I want to briefly discuss empirical work by me that has been cited just in the previous two talks already. So I guess I don't have to go into too much detail there. More interesting perhaps will be for you what I think is going to be research for future research agendas. So what I think is still missing in the landscape of researching networks and cognition, and what we may or may not be able to do about it. And yeah, when I present this kind of research to people outside the aging context, I usually start with saying that due to the aging population, Western societies are going to face a really big rise in older people in absolute numbers, but also in age-related diseases. So the prevalence of diseases like dementia is going up vastly. And since I'm working with data in the Netherlands, it's always really nice to kind of visualize this increase. So the Netherlands has 16 million inhabitants. And if we look into the year of 2050, that is almost we're getting so close to 1 million cases in the future here that will face dementia. So this is a really big issue in the future of modern societies, not only in the Netherlands, but worldwide. So both policymakers and researchers are asking, what are the markers of dementia in old age? What could we possibly do about it to intervene? And as we do know from existing research, integration into social networks can have a protective effect against dementia. So better quality of social relationships will be protective of dementia. And I always like to first define what I personally mean with a social network, or in this case, the personal network, which is a central person ego linked through social ties to a number of alters, in this case, 5 alters. And these people can have different characteristics, different attributes, different behaviors, norms. And also the relationships can differ in terms of intensity, balance, in terms of the resources and support that flow through these social relationships. And what is important to keep in mind is that ego has some influence, of course, in her own direct ties to alters. However, the interrelationships between the alters is something that is mostly going beyond the influence of ego. However, they still have an effect on the research flow for ego. So this is just something to keep in mind, that there are constraints and opportunities from the broader network structure that have an effect on ego, whereas ego cannot affect these structures directly a lot of the time. So this is really, the sum of the network is basically bigger than its individual actors. And often networks are described in terms of their function and structure. And you of course know what I mean. Function is about the more qualitative aspects of the networks, which kind of emotional and instrumental support flows through relationships, but it can also be advice or practical help. And it's also about the subjective perception of ego perceiving the network as being useful or not so useful. On the other hand, we have these structural aspects that I already mentioned, which is the size of the network in terms of the number of alters we have, but also the composition of the relationships. So one aspect being the interrelationships, whether they exist or not in the network. Is it dense or is it rather fractured with a lot of bridges? Do we have a lot of subcomponents or clusters? But also the structure in terms of the attributes that actors bring with them. So do we have a lot of different kind of people in the network, or they're all very similar? So do they have different social roles, for example? Is someone mainly integrated in a family-based network where everyone knows everyone and they're all tied through a family relationship? Or do we also see non-kin in the network, meaning, for example, contacts to neighbors or co-workers, co-employees? be it before, after retirement, members from church, volunteer workers, perhaps caretakers. So structure really is about the quantifiable aspects of the social network. And a lot of the research I find is focused on the functional aspects of social networks. And as we have seen from previous meta studies, but also today, is that structural aspects also have a contribution and perhaps are even more strongly linked to cognition and old age. And this was the main motivation to look into more of these composite or mainly one composite measure of social networks. And I'm arguing that based on the use it or lose it hypothesis, we need to constantly be involved in social interactions in order to keep our brain fit. So we do know from research that these engagements in social interactions are beneficial for also staying fit, not only physically, but also mentally. So interaction with other people is challenging. It asks a lot of attention and focus. And the more complex these interactions are and the more varied these interactions are, the more stimulation and challenges, intellectual challenges we can expect. Based on this hypothesis, a lot of social interaction is a big source of stimulation that keeps the brain fit and active. However, it's not only about the mere quantity of interactions, but preferably interactions are non-redundant as such that they offer a lot of different kind of stimuli and challenge a person in multiple ways through interactions with many different people. So not only a family-based network, but perhaps also have a lot of contact with neighbors or people from sports unions. This gives you a lot of different input, and the environmental complexity model bases on the mouse model and more specifically even says that a challenging, complex environment is something that stimulates the brain and keeps neurons active. And through this mechanism, it has a protective effect on memory. So if we link this back now to a network structure, this would mean the more different people a person is connected to, the more different stimuli this person receives, and the easier it will be to be exposed to a complex social environment that helps someone being cognitively engaged in these social interaction. And also importantly, the more social roles you find in the social network, the less likely it is that contacts are all interconnected. So they might be quite separate, and a person will have to switch between these social circles or foci, as we just heard in the previous presentation. So I'm very much in line with the hypothesis that Federico proposed, which I summarize as that greater complexity or greater role diversity in the personal network should be related to higher cognitive function in older people and also a slower cognitive decline as a result of that. And the data that I used together with my co-authors from the Netherlands, Theo van Tilbroek and Maya Aartsen, is from the longitudinal aging study, Amsterdam. This is a beautiful longitudinal population-based data set that has been collected since 1992, every 3 years, and people were 54 years or older. And all sorts of modules are included in that. Of course, all the relevant health aspects are measured, but also a quite extensive module on measuring social relationships and the social network. And the dependent variable in this study was the mini mental state examination that you all know, so I don't have to go into detail here, I guess. And the independent variable was network diversity, which is counting the number of social roles in a person's personal network. However, we would single out only those contacts who a person had contact with at least once in 2 weeks. So you had to have at least a minimum exposure to these people. So at least once every 2 weeks talking to that person. And then since we counted the number of social roles, we would only ever count a new role. So here we have a network size represented with 5 alters, but this is only 3 social roles that count into the network diversity index, because 2 people have the same role, 2 more people have a strong relationship with that person, and another person was a more sporadic contact, so didn't count into that index. So here, size of the network is 5, but the diversity is a score of 3. So that's quite, it is correlated, but it is a different way of measuring network complexity. And confounders in the model were just a few usual suspects, including, of course, network size. There were not too many confounders included because we used fixed effects models, which mean that you compare a person with herself over time. So you take the network information and the cognitive the information on the cognitive score and compare this over time for the same person. This more easily permits causal statements. It's not a perfect experimental setup, but as close as it gets with survey data, fixed effects models are one way of trying to make causal inferences. And according to the results, as we have already seen in the previous presentations, network diversity indeed was positively related with cognitive function at baseline, but also over time, meaning that those older people having more social roles in their network experienced a slower cognitive decline over time. And just to visualize this, this is the main effect without time. Here we see that there is some difference. Those who didn't have any network had a score just above 26, and those who had a lot of social roles had a score of 28. So a difference of nearly 2, which is quite big considering that the MMSE scale is not strictly speaking a metric scale, but more of an ordinal scale. If we see that below 24, we would consider people as being exposed to the risk of dementia. So if we only look at this scale 25 scores upwards, this is quite a meaningful difference. Most people did have 4 to 5 roles. So in the middle of this graph, which you can also see due to the small confidence interval. So there's somewhat better cognitive function for people with diverse networks. And over time, this is replicated. Those who are integrated into networks with a lot of social roles just have a less steep decline, maybe half score point, whereas those who had no diversity experienced a decline of about 2 scores. So this can be meaningful in daily life and daily interactions for people. And yeah, I just want to defend a little bit that reverse causality was never a topic in previous research. I did at least try to tackle it in some ways by double checking with lagged covariates where diversity was measured as a previous time point. Also double check this with random effects models and alternative subdomains of cognition. And in conclusion, I would say there is a positive, not very large, but positive relationship between network diversity and cognition. And this effect is stronger when you look at the data cross-sectionally, because as soon as you introduce lag variables, this effect, of course, goes down. This is not a surprise. And I also strongly believe in the opposite direction of the effect. When people have trouble maintaining their social network, of course, they will be dropping weaker ties at some point. So we simply should model it both ways and be open to reverse causation. Just to sum up this first part, I do see support for the use it or lose it hypothesis and the environmental complexity hypothesis, because the effects that we did find were independent of network size. Network size also had an effect, however, the complexity effect really was on top of that. So I agree with the findings from Federico that being involved in different kinds of network clusters can have an added value and make an independent contribution. This can be really important when we talk about interventions. So it's not only about knowing a lot of people, you have to know a lot of different people. And something else I want to talk about, what are the next steps now based on the kind of data that we have and the knowledge that we have? When we look at current research, a problem that I perceive, and I'm including myself in causing that problem, is that there's a big focus on studying direct ties. So usually we only know about the relationships between ego and alter, also mostly because this is the way that data are measured in large scale surveys. So I'm totally including myself in this. And I just want to show in the next few minutes how this can be a problem for research in cognition if we continue focusing solely on the direct ties and ignoring the alter-alter ties between contexts in the network. First of all, we just talked about that involvement in different kinds of social foci or clusters can be interesting and stimulating and hence beneficial for cognition. And so-called bridges are facilitating these classes, but also in search of, for example, a physician who specializes in Alzheimer's disease. A person might ask, hey, do you know someone who specializes in Alzheimer's disease? And that friend might say, no, I don't. However, I do have a friend who works in a hospital. Let me ask that person. So this friend of the friend can work as a multiplier and basically yield access to new information that you wouldn't have without these so-called bridges. So from social capital theory, we would assume that having a lot of bridges in the network are helpful for health, but perhaps also for cognition. However, here again, we have the problem of reverse causality, that people with a limited cognitive capacity will be less capable of detecting such bridges or will be less capable of exhausting these kind of bridges. Another topic is embeddedness. Again, we do know from some of the literature that has dealt with reverse causation that weak ties are likely to be dropped in the case of disease, onset of disability, but also when cognitive functioning goes down. And here you could hypothesize, well, if there are a lot of interconnections in the personal network, perhaps just through the embeddedness and mutual ties, these ties will survive longer. So again, these interrelationships are beyond the influence a lot of the time of ego. However, they can still have an effect on ego's network and direct ties. So this mutual embeddedness might preserve social ties for a longer time and be protective of network decay. Another topic is balance in networks. We do know from the network literature that people have a strong preference for balanced contexts in the network. So if I have two friends, I want them to like each other, not to fight. Another example would be in family research. We do know that conflicts of family members often extend to third parties. Really hard not to get involved. So I myself may have really good relationships with both my mother and my sister. However, if they continue to fight, I have a problem. I cannot invite the two of them to my birthday. I will be expected to take sides. I will constantly receive negative feedback from one person about the other person. And this can cause me stress. Balance theory assumes that these imbalanced ties cause stress. And we do know from the literature on cognitive functioning that stress is bad. It kills neurons or neural activity. So again, if we would look beyond just the direct ties of ego, we would see perhaps a network that initially looks functional is not that functional after all. Or at least network integration comes at the cost of stressful imbalance. And finally, similarly, we could take into account more the behavior and norms of other people who are also integrated themselves in their own personal networks. And if drinking is the norm, for example, which again is bad for cognitive functioning in old age, we could say, well, it might be hard to not participate in this more social drinking behavior. And again, here network integration would come at the cost of another more harmful health outcome, perhaps. So just to sum up, my idea here is that we really should make the effort and look beyond direct ties, include indirect ties in our measurement, because we might come to quite different predictions. So our hypothesis might be more complex. Our research designs should change accordingly. And then if results are also different, our intervention approaches would have to be different. And this is not easy to solve because it all depends on the right kind of data. And so, no, I want to go back. Sorry. Now my summary has vanished. I'm sorry, I'm doing this again. It should go here. So if I have a few minutes left, I just want to show how I go on about this. So most current research is just counting the number of people in the network, perhaps even without specifying the quality of the relationships. A more standard these days is to actually include the relationships in the research design. So we know what's the specific relationship with each of the alters in the network. More preferable would be to include also the interconnections for the reasons that I just presented. And if we really want to go the extra mile, we should probably include whole sociometric network in our research design. However, in contrast to studying schools or organizations, often the question is what are actually natural boundaries in a community of older adults if we don't want to rely on researching retirement homes. So whereas current research is mostly focused on just the alters and the direct relationships with ego, we would actually have a more realistic research design as soon as we include some of the interconnections between these alters. And large-scale data sets currently existing are listed on this slide. A lot of them have a limitation in terms of how many alters are asked. The longitudinal aging study Amsterdam does not have such a limitation, which is great. However, usually this is modules integrated into larger data collection projects and cannot solely focus just on the eliciting the social networks of a person. However, as I just said, this also limits the ability for researchers to test really complex network structures. So my personal to-do list says we should be collecting more network data and also use network analysis to assess these and hopefully be able to share results that are also pointing into future intervention tactics. What I did last year is that I was able to include an additional data collection in the longitudinal aging study Amsterdam. So this is the study that was part of the previous research I presented, and every 3 years people are interviewed in face-to-face interviews, including asking about their alters and the relationships with their alters. And what we did, Theo and I, is we did include an extra study that focused solely on measuring these alter ties in order to be able to test more complex hypotheses in the future. So the main interview would already generate this kind of information. So we know who's ego and the alters and what's the relationships like. So that was totally unchanged. But then people were invited to participate in a small add-on study. So in the main interview, they were asked whether they would be happy to participate in the follow-up study. And this is done quite often in these LASA survey, a lot of the time to keep people motivated and participating and to keep them interested in also joining in new topics or not always ask just the panel questions over and over again. They're sometimes invited to small studies in between the main interviews. And here we did assess these alter ties. So most people were really happy to receive the extra questionnaire. As you can see, more than 90% agreed. And up front, we explained this is going to be questions about the people that they just generated in the main interview, just to avoid surprises, because it can be quite intriguing to be asked about your context, even more questions, and people might worry, oh, but now I'm saying something about a person who's not part of this survey. Am I okay doing that? And in the Netherlands, most people were okay doing that. We had to exclude people who, for whatever reason, had to terminate the interview on their social networks. And of course, we needed a minimum of 2 alters generated in the main interview to ask any questions on the alter ties. But this was a small proportion of this sample. Interestingly, this is what we did. We did send out written questionnaires that were pre-filled in with their existing contacts that they had generated in the main interview, and then asking about the frequency of these contacts and whether people liked or disliked each other. So specifically here, you would see that you would have a lot of questions about person A, and then again for person B, C, D, and E. So these people, this was names, actual names in the questionnaire that we pre-filled in for every respondent. So every participant got a personalized questionnaire that was pre-filled in with these names, because we were worried that if you ask the population that is quite old, they will not remember or will not understand how to fill in this survey. They come up perhaps with a completely different list of alters. And so we made sure that basically no later than 1 month after the main interview, they received this additional questionnaire. This was really to ensure reliability of the data, but also validity. and we limited to the first 5 contacts. So we had a maximum of 10 follow-up questions per scale. So this fitted nicely on a questionnaire on one sheet with a rather large print. And it was also filled in quite well. So we had a good response, I think more than 70%. And because we were already busy collecting more data, we also collected some extra questions on disliking relationships. So whether people actually had conflicted relationships. This surprisingly is often not included in these large-scale aging surveys. So I also wanted to know more about whether sometimes there were demanding social relationships. And the beauty of this research design is that you could basically implement this in any existing large-scale aging survey. It is possible also to do it over time. People can do it in their own time at home, even take breaks, and you can test much more complex hypotheses than with the data that we have at hand usually. However, a downside is that you're changing the mode. Ego does serve as a proxy. So essentially, we are only drawing cognitive maps because ego is reporting on the alter-alter relationships, and we never invited actual alters to the study. However, whenever we are dealing with outcomes of mental health, for example, I would argue that the perception perhaps is the more important aspects than the objective assessment. So if I think people are fighting, will have more of an impact on me whether as compared to whether other people think that they are fighting. So it is useful with some limitations. And yeah, this was things I did in the past and I'm doing at the moment in a nutshell. And actually I was lucky enough that the last questionnaire arrived just like 2 weeks before the first lockdown in the Netherlands. So this was extremely lucky. It would have been very painful to have it in the middle. And I still have to analyze this kind of data. And hopefully some first results I can present at the Sunbelt this year. That's my personal deadline at least. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. Curious about your questions.
Lea, well, it was a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for your presentation, and very brilliant also having you sharing a little bit of the future of your research agenda. So any question to Lea?
I have one, if I may, but otherwise I should have.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Lea. Very, very interesting. So I'm not an expert in what you call this sociometric network, but I find it very, very interesting, as I was saying before with Federico. My question, so it is just out of curiosity and for pure intuition. Is there any differences? So we speak about old age or older people as a whole, but does there exist any differences across the whole old age span, right? In terms of how people may benefit from this complexity of this structural network. So, and this is pure intuition, I would expect that perhaps as we move on towards older ages, well, this complexity of the structural composition, I don't know, its weight might change, it might become lower, and then perhaps the size matters more. Is there such a literature? Are there differences by chronological age in terms of the importance of these different components of the social network?
Well, in my own research, I always stratify per age group and check whether it's different in the young old as compared to in the old, and it was not. However, this is just the Netherlands and just my statistical approach to it. Theoretically, we would expect that the more the end of life approaches, the more important it is for people to focus rather on a small set of very emotionally supportive relationships. So this is what social emotional selectivity theory would predict. So I would say maintaining a rather complex network is useful, especially when health needs do change. So we're able to mobilize resources that we can that help us adapt to age-related changes in life, perhaps disability as well. We will be more needy in terms of instrumental support. But at some point, I think it can be worthwhile perhaps to drop some of the complexity and change it in for the more useful, preferably multifunctional ties.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Federico has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Lea, for this very stimulating presentation. I particularly appreciated the last part of it, where you touched upon some of the crucial points of the whole network analysis literature nowadays. And we have made giant steps in modeling and analytical strategies. We are so weak in data collection, indeed. So I was wondering if I've been growing an interest on visual softwares for network data collection. I was wondering if you know something about it, if you have experience on using them. For example, one of the last published ones is called Network Canvas. It's mainly visually based. I know very little of it, so I was wondering if you knew something. And the other thing concerning concerning modeling, since there's a clear trade-off between large samples and fine-grade ego networks, I was wondering about these new methods to extend a sample of ego networks to generate the whole population. So there's two research groups who are working on it at the moment. I was wondering if you have an opinion about this.
Thank you for this great question, and we should definitely stay in touch, because you're exactly pointing to my future research agenda. I will hopefully be able to start collecting complete network data next year. I already got the money for that. I'm still looking for people to do that. And I'm delaying this purposefully just a little bit, because this whole pandemic has destroyed my research design. If I start collecting data now, I'm doing a baseline measurement of probably very poor networks with zero contacts in a lot of the people. So I kind of want to wait until this COVID effect has vanished and then start my data collection. So I want to go and find community centers and ask people about their relationships with one another, but in addition, also ask them about their relationships outside this center. So I want to combine a complete sociometric approach with an egocentric approach using mixed methods, whereas the sociometric approach for within the community center will be very quantitative, with the aim of using ergom models, perhaps even R-Sienna, if I manage to do more waves. This will depend a bit on when I can actually start collecting data. And these ego networks that can reach beyond these boundaries of the community center will be using qualitative methods. And then, as you suggested, tools also to visualize during the data collection. So one tool is the Venn maker that hasn't been developed further in the past. This is has been invented by my colleague Markus Gamper, who also works at the University of Cologne. So if you're interested in learning about VenMaker, I can totally get you guys in touch. I have also heard about Network Canvas, which seems to be very new. And I'm pleased to say that just last week, I myself signed up for that workshop at the Sunbelt conference. So ask me again at the beginning of July, and I hope I'll know more about it. But I'm interested in using that, and that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll see you at the workshop then.
Oh, cool.
Okay, good to know that. Happy about that. So thank you very much. So it's probably time for a break, so that we can at least stand up and drink something and refresh a little bit. I'd like to thank you all the presenters of this first morning session. And we will be back at, let me see here, in 11:15. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes, 13 minutes, something like that to relax. Thank you very much for this first session, and see you at 11:15. Thank you. Ciao, Alessandra. It's good to see you.